When the Mongol armies first broke into the Islamic world, several writers were close enough to the events to capture their scale and impact with unusual immediacy. One of the earliest and most detailed accounts comes from a historian based in Mosul, who described the invasions as a sudden and overwhelming collapse of an entire political order. Only a few years earlier, the Khwarezmian ruler had controlled a vast empire, yet it disintegrated with astonishing speed once the Mongols advanced. This was not seen as a simple military defeat, but as the result of fragile leadership and internal instability that left the region exposed. What impressed observers most was the speed and reach of the Mongol campaigns. In a remarkably short time, their forces moved out from East Asia, swept across Central Asia, crossed northern Iran, and reached the borders of Iraq. Other units operated far to the south and east, moving through Sistan and the edges of the Indian world. Even regions that had resisted earlier conquests for decades fell without sustained resistance. The reason seemed clear. Once established, leaders had been removed and rival powers weakened. There was no unified authority left to organize a defense. The tone of these early accounts is dominated by a deep sense of disaster. The invasions unfolded alongside other major crises, including foreign attacks on Egypt and constant conflict among Muslim rulers themselves. Instead of presenting a united front, these leaders were divided, often more concerned with their own rivalries than with the larger threat. Some writers even repeated rumours that internal political struggles had indirectly contributed to the disaster by inviting outside forces into the conflict. In such a climate, the absence of strong leadership became a recurring theme. There was a growing belief that no ruler possessed the ability or vision to defend the wider world. Although one figure briefly appeared as a potential leader, his own actions were marked by violence and instability, making him an uncertain and ultimately ineffective hope. At first, there were moments when it seemed that the devastation might not be permanent. Some believed that divine intervention had already spared certain regions from complete destruction. Others misunderstood the intentions of the Mongols, assuming that they were interested only in plunder and would eventually withdraw. This assumption proved to be a serious miscalculation. Over time, reports began to emerge that the invaders were not simply raiders, but conquerors seeking long-term control. By the time this realization spread, the consequences of that misunderstanding had already become clear. Another perspective comes from a writer who served closely with the last major Khwarezmian ruler during the final phase of resistance. His account is shaped by direct experience and personal loyalty, focusing less on the Mongols themselves and more on the desperate attempts to rebuild power after the collapse. He presents his ruler as the final barrier against the advancing forces, emphasizing his endurance and determination in the face of constant setbacks. The narrative moves across different regions and moments, reflecting the instability of the period. Yet even within this account, the harsh reality remains visible. The same forces that resisted the Mongols also inflicted suffering on local populations, leaving behind a reputation for brutality that could not be ignored. A third writer, working some decades later from the safety of India, offers a broader and more reflective interpretation. Having lived through the early stages of the invasions, he combined personal memory with reports from refugees who had fled westward. His view is stark and uncompromising. While he occasionally acknowledges certain qualities in Mongol leadership, he ultimately describes them as a destructive force that overwhelmed nearly the entire known world. In his account, the invasions are part of a larger pattern of external pressure that had been building for generations. The scale of destruction leads him to suggest that these events mark a turning point in history itself, giving his narrative an almost apocalyptic tone. Within this framework, one political centre stands out as a rare survivor, portrayed as a final refuge in a world otherwise consumed by conquest. Other contemporary observers add further detail, even when their information comes indirectly. Travellers who pass through eastern regions just before the invasions describe areas of great wealth and stability, making their later destruction all the more striking. Others gathered stories from refugees and merchants, reconstructing the fate of cities that had been devastated or abandoned. Some accounts use highly dramatic language to emphasize the scale of the catastrophe, portraying it as an event that overshadowed all previous disasters. Even when exaggerated, these descriptions reflect the emotional intensity of the moment and the sense that something unprecedented had occurred. There are also sources that reveal less expected perspectives. In some cases, certain groups initially maintained cautious or even cooperative relations with the Mongols, interpreting their arrival in ways that did not immediately fit the pattern of simple invasion. Meanwhile, writers based in major urban centres attempted to document events as they unfolded, though not all of their accounts are equally reliable. Some confuse different campaigns or misinterpret key developments, while others become more accurate when describing events closer to their own time and location. Further west, particularly in Syria and Egypt, the early stages of the Mongol advance were not always seen as an immediate danger. Some writers focused instead on other threats and were able to ignore the Mongols entirely for a time. However, as the situation evolved, historians in these regions began to record the expansion of Mongol influence into Iraq, Anatolia, and beyond. They also describe the emergence of resistance, especially from forces based in Egypt, which eventually succeeded in halting further expansion. A later generation of historians wrote under Mongol rule itself, offering a noticeably different tone. One such writer, born after the initial wave of destruction, served within the new political system and had access to official circles as well as inherited accounts of earlier events. His work reflects a complex balance between criticism and adaptation. While he acknowledges the devastation caused by the invasions, he also portrays the new rulers as agents of order, emphasizing their role in restoring stability and reorganizing the regions they controlled. In some passages, their rise is interpreted as part of a broader pattern, suggesting that even such destructive events might contribute to long-term transformation. This shift becomes especially clear in descriptions of later campaigns. Instead of focusing entirely on destruction, attention is given to reconstruction, governance, and the re-establishment of authority. The narrative moves away from immediate catastrophe toward a longer process of adjustment, as societies begin to adapt to new political realities. Yet the memory of the earlier devastation remains present, shaping how these changes are understood. For a long time, the years between the great history of Juwayni and the later work of Rashid al-Din were often treated as a strangely silent stretch in the written record. It seemed as though one major voice had faded before another truly emerged. There were a few scattered works from that interval, but most were brief, selective, or limited in scope. Some offered only a thin outline of events, while others were little more than compressed dynastic summaries. One Persian chronicle from the late 13th century became relatively well known, not because it was rich in detail, but because it showed an early effort to place Mongol rule within an Iranian cultural framework. That alone made it important. It revealed that educated Persian Muslims were already trying to understand how a foreign ruling house might be fitted into older ideas of kingship, legitimacy, and historical continuity. That apparent silence has become less absolute thanks to the discovery of another text, an anonymous chronicle preserved inside a larger manuscript collection. This work stretches from the first arrival of the Mongols to the enthronement of Argan, and although it is uneven in structure, it is invaluable. It does not read like a polished narrative written from beginning to end. Instead, it feels closer to a set of historical notes, assembled over time, with sudden jumps, missing years, and an often wandering style. Yet precisely because of that roughness, it preserves material absent from better-known authors. It gives a more textured picture of the reigns of Hulegu and Abaka, including military preparations, court tensions, and the roots of conflicts within the wider Mongol world. At points, it seems to preserve traditions that later historians either ignored or no longer possessed. Even its very incompleteness hints at how much material once circulated beyond the famous official histories. After the conversion of the Ilkhans to Islam, historical writing in Iran entered a new phase. The towering figure of this period was Rashid al-Din, a statesman of immense ambition, wide learning, and extraordinary influence. He came from a Jewish family of physicians and eventually rose to become chief minister under Ghazan and Oljetu. The scale of the literary enterprise associated with his name is astonishing. His works covered far more than political history, but his most famous achievement was a vast universal chronicle designed to preserve the memory of dynasties, peoples, and empires on an almost global scale. It was meant to endure. Copies were to be reproduced regularly, and the project clearly aimed at permanence, authority, and prestige. His history stands as one of the clearest examples of state-sponsored writing in the Mongol age. It was not simply history written near power, it was history shaped within power, commissioned by rulers who wanted their reigns explained, justified, and remembered in a particular way. In that sense, Rashid al-Din's narrative demands caution. His portrait of Ghazan's reign, for example, emphasizes disorder before reform and justice after reform, presenting the Ilkhanate as a realm renewed by the wisdom and energy of its Muslim ruler. But such a picture may owe as much to political intention as to reality. Administrative reform is one thing in official decrees and another in practice across a vast empire. A minister describing the success of a system he helped design is never a neutral observer. His background also shaped the tone of his work in ways that differed sharply from earlier historians. Juwayni had belonged to an established bureaucratic family, and wrote as a man rooted in older Persian Muslim traditions, even while serving Mongol masters. Rashid al-Din came from a different world. He was a relative outsider who rose through service, favour, and adaptability. His conversion to Islam, his closeness to the ruling house, and the hostility he faced from rivals, all made public expressions of loyalty and religious commitment especially important. Praise for Muslim Ilkhans was not merely flattery. It was also political self-protection, moral positioning, and perhaps a declaration of belonging in a court where suspicion could be deadly. There are also major differences in the scope of his history. Juwayni had written magnificently, but his work was still centered mainly on the Mongol conquest and the transformation of Iran and neighboring lands. Rashid al-Din went much further. He sought to write not only the history of the Ilkhans, but the history of the Mongols as a people, their tribal origins, the life of Chingis Khan, the succession of the great Khans, and the branching lines of Chingisid power. He aimed to bring his account closer to Mongol memory and Mongol tradition than earlier Muslim authors had done. To do this, he relied on oral testimony from Mongol informants, including men closely connected to the ruling elite, and on written sources that are now lost. The result is not always critically organized. Different traditions are often placed side by side without much effort to resolve contradictions. But it remains the nearest surviving approach to a Mongol-centered telling of the empire's expansion after the earliest native narratives fall silent. The second half of his project widened the lens even further. Under the encouragement of Oljetu, the chronicle expanded into a broad survey of other peoples and civilizations. It came to include accounts of Turks, Oghuz traditions, China, India, the Jews, the Franks, Armenians, and earlier Muslim dynasties. This was no longer just a dynastic record. It was an attempt to assemble the known world into a single, historical vision. The breadth of that ambition is what makes the work so remarkable. It was created in an Iranian Mongol court, yet it looked outward in every direction. Scholars, informants, and travellers from many backgrounds contributed to this widening of perspective. The work reflects a court culture that had become intensely curious about the peoples under Mongol rule and beyond it. Rashid al-Din also produced a separate genealogical work that is especially important because it preserves names and lineages with unusual precision. In some cases, it offers forms of names in more than one script, helping later readers identify people and titles more accurately. It may overlap heavily with parts of the larger chronicle, but it contains enough additions and corrections to stand on its own as a major source. In the study of Mongol political and family networks, such detail is invaluable. Not all important writing from this period came directly from Rashid al-Din or his circle. Other historians covered the reign of Oljetu and the years that followed. One author produced a work heavily dependent on Rashid al-Din, but continued the story into a later reign and inserted new material. Another wrote a much richer account devoted specifically to Oljetu. That narrative is arranged year by year and appears to draw on some form of court record. It contains details that survive nowhere else, even if its organization can be repetitive and careless. The same event is sometimes told twice, yet that untidiness is the price of preserving information that a cleaner narrative might have omitted. Around the same time, another historian set out to continue the story, from the point where Juwayni had stopped. His work is famous not only for the range of material it covers, but also for its elaborate and overblown style. The prose swells with ornament and rhetorical display, sometimes to exhausting effect. Yet beneath that language lies a work of real importance. It deals not only with Ilkhanid affairs, but with events in Central Asia and even China. It is especially valuable for southern Iran because its author was deeply attached to his native region and wrote with the eye of someone who knew its society, economy, and politics from within. He was not merely describing an empire, he was watching how that empire touched the provinces. By the early 14th century, several more historians appeared, many of them connected to courts or administrative circles. Some wrote general histories, others created verse chronicles modelled on epic Persian tradition. These works often relied heavily on Rashid al-Din, but they were not simple copies. They preserved variant details, added local knowledge, and extended the narrative into the reign of Abu Sa'id. One writer in particular, a fiscal official with a strong interest in administration, inserted valuable observations on taxation, provincial organisation, and economic life. Such evidence is crucial because it reveals the actual workings of Mongol rule beyond the battlefield and the throne room. Through these texts, the empire begins to look less like a line of conquests and more like a complicated governing system that reshaped land, labour, revenue, and local society. Regional histories add another layer. These works are called local, but they are not local in the sense of small urban memory or neighbourhood chronicle. They were often produced at courts of subordinate dynasties and still retained a strong interest in rulers, succession, and dynastic legitimacy. Their viewpoint, however, is regional rather than imperial. Iraq, Anatolia, Herat, Sistan, Kirman, Shiraz, Yazd, and the Caspian lands all produce narratives that capture how Mongol rule was experienced far from the main centres of Ilkhanid power. Some of these historians borrowed freely from larger works, yet they also preserved distinctive material about rebellions, provincial politics, local families, and the survival strategies of lesser courts, living under Mongol supremacy. Iraq is particularly interesting because one Arabic history, written under the Ilkhans, shows how difficult it is to place some authors neatly within political or religious categories. The writer clearly viewed the destruction of the caliphate as a catastrophe, yet at the same time referred to Hulagu in the language of sovereignty. There is no simple line here between resistance and acceptance. The old order had collapsed, but life continued under new rulers, and language adjusted to that reality. The same complexity appears in Anatolia, where several histories trace the weakening of the Seljuks under Mongol dominance. In the east, the history of Herat offers especially rich material for a region otherwise less visible in the grand imperial chronicles. Beyond narrative histories, the Ilkhanid world also left behind other kinds of evidence. A major biographical dictionary from the period is especially valuable because it does not confine itself to Muslims. It includes Christians, Jews, and even non-Muslim Mongol rulers, reflecting a wider social field than earlier Muslim compilations usually allowed. Though incomplete and sometimes disorderly, it opens a window into the plural world of Mongol Iran. Administrative manuals survive as well, offering practical information about accounting, rank, and office. These works may lack the drama of chronicles, but they reveal the machinery of rule. By contrast, official letters from leading statesmen are far less useful than once hoped. Some collections contain almost nothing of real historical substance, while others are now regarded as later fabrications. Hagiographical writings, though difficult to use, also shed light on Mongol society. Collections of saintly anecdotes are shaped by miracle stories rather than chronology, yet they preserve social realities that formal chronicles ignore. Through them, glimpses appear of popular religion, rural life, local devotion, and the moral imagination of the period. Mystical authors who had once moved in Ilkhanid court circles provide yet another angle, especially on the religious atmosphere surrounding rulers who had not yet converted to Islam. Outside Iran, the picture becomes more fragmented. The lands of Jochi produced no strong, native historical tradition during these centuries, so the history of the Golden Horde must be reconstructed from foreign observers, neighbouring chronicles, and much later works based on oral tradition. These later texts are not useless. On the contrary, they preserve memories of administration, conversion, and political culture that would otherwise be lost. But they stand at some chronological distance from the events they describe, which means they must be handled carefully. The Chagatai realm left a somewhat better record, though still a thin one. One important writer from Central Asia appended a historical supplement to a dictionary carrying the narrative down into the Mongol period. He had strong ties to courts and administrative elites, yet even his account is more concise than one might wish. For later Chagatai history, historians working under the Timurids become essential. They wrote from a world shaped by Timur's rise, and that fact deeply affected their treatment of the past. Their accounts of the earlier Chagatai Khans often contain errors in chronology, confused genealogy, and a tendency to exaggerate the importance of Timur's own ancestral line. This is history written not simply to preserve memory, but to elevate a dynasty by projecting its authority backward. In the eastern part of the former Chagatai world, another historian wrote in the 16th century with a strong interest in legitimizing his own lineage and glorifying the house to which he was connected. He provides useful information on the conversion of rulers to Islam, but says much less about non-Muslim Khans. Silence here is meaningful. Memory is being shaped not only by what is remembered, but by what is left aside. A very different body of material comes from lands that stood in opposition to the Ilkhans. The Mamluk Empire in Egypt and Syria produced a huge amount of historical writing. Some of it took the form of biographies of sultans, composed by men in royal service and designed to celebrate their patrons. These works have an official character of their own, matching Mongol court histories with a rival political vision. The Mamluk rulers, supported by a revived Abbasid caliph in Cairo, claimed a universal legitimacy that stood directly against Mongol imperial claims. The Mamluk world also generated major chronicles, many of them rich in political and diplomatic detail. Some authors were especially interested in foreign relations and recorded valuable information about the Golden Horde, Anatolia, and contacts across the wider Mongol world. Others, writing in Syria, continued earlier historical traditions while paying close attention to events inside the Ilkhanate. Their works are especially useful because they combine analytic structure with obituary notices, allowing historians to trace political events and the lives of notable individuals side by side. Though some authors are more often cited than they deserve, several provide precious first-hand or near-contemporary material. Geographical works from the Mamluk sphere also contain unexpectedly important historical evidence. A topographical dictionary of Syria and the Jazira, for instance, preserves details of Mongol campaigns and regional power struggles that do not survive elsewhere. Another geographical survey, though often dependent on earlier materials, still offers useful information for the Mongol age. These works remind us that geography and history were often intertwined. To describe a place was also to recount who ruled it, who fought over it, and how it changed. Two major encyclopedic works from the Mamluk world are especially significant because they include sustained discussions of the Mongols as a civilization and political force. One author, a government clerk with direct opportunities to meet Mongols, provided a broad survey of the Mongol world inside a much larger encyclopedia. Another, who headed the Mamluk chancery, was even better positioned to gather intelligence from merchants, envoys, and diplomatic networks stretching across Eurasia. His account is particularly valuable because it reflects the perspective of the Golden Horde and other powers allied with the Mamluks, offering a view of Mongol history that differs sharply from the one preserved in Ilkhanid Iran. Biographical dictionaries written in Egypt and Syria also preserve important notices on Mongol rulers and commanders. Some entries concern Muslim Mongol rulers, but others include men who never converted. This is significant. It shows that even hostile or rival scholarly environments could not ignore the central place of Mongol figures in the history of the age. Through these dictionaries, scattered details survive on rulers, officials, generals, and religious figures whose lives crossed the boundaries between Mongol and Muslim worlds. In India, the record is thinner. After the great earlier historian of the Delhi Sultanate, surviving narrative histories become rare for a time. Poetry fills part of the gap, and later, authors return to the subject with works that combine political narrative with reflection on kingship, morality, and the shape of Islamic history. Their treatment of Mongol invasions is usually limited, but they still matter because they reveal how those invasions were remembered on the edge of the Mongol sphere rather than at its center. The great traveller Ibn Battuta also adds an important dimension. He visited large parts of the Mongol world and left a narrative that is often vivid, concrete, and full of social detail. Yet his work is not free from problems. Some journeys are doubtful, some itineraries are confused, and parts of the narrative clearly contain material borrowed from hearsay or imagination. Even so, where his testimony can be trusted, it greatly enriches the picture, especially for the northern Khanates. Bar-Hebraeus wrote a second historical work that differs noticeably in tone and purpose from his Syriac chronicle. For a long time, it was treated as little more than an Arabic summary of that earlier work, begun late in his life for a Muslim audience in Moraga and left unfinished. That assumption no longer holds. The Arabic version does omit certain details found in the Syriac narrative, but it also adds material that does not appear there at all, including an account of the fall of Baghdad drawn from another important line of transmission. More importantly, the entire shape of the work is different. The Syriac chronicle belongs to the tradition of Christian universal history and speaks from within that intellectual world. The Arabic text, by contrast, is clearly designed for readers formed by Islamic historical writing. Its language, structure, and selection of material all show that Bar-Hebraeus was not simply translating himself. He was adapting his historical vision to a different audience, using a different literary culture and a different set of expectations. An even sharper picture of how unstable Christian fortunes could be under the early Ilkhans comes from the life of the Nestorian patriarch Yahbalaha and his companion Rabban Sauma. Their story opens not in Iran or Iraq, but in the far eastern reaches of the Mongol world. They arrived from the domains of Kubilai and entered Iran at a time when Christian communities could still hope that Mongol power might favour them. The narrative that survives is especially valuable because it also preserves part of Rabban Sauma's lost account of his embassy to Western Europe on behalf of the Ilkhan Arjun. Yet its greatest importance lies elsewhere. It shows in vivid and human terms how the churches flourished under pagan Ilkhan rulers, and then suffered mounting pressure both before and after the ruling house turned toward Islam. The work may well have been written to defend the reputation of Yahbalaha himself, whose policies had brought little lasting success. If that is so, the text becomes even more revealing because it is not only a record of events, but also an attempt to explain why Christian hopes had faded. The Georgian historical tradition preserves a few useful glimpses of the Mongol age, but Armenian writers are much more important for this period. In Greater Armenia, which had once been closely tied to the Georgian crown before passing under Mongol control, several historians recorded the transformation of the region. Some wrote with care and restraint, producing narratives that are measured in tone and attentive to political reality. Others were less reliable and allowed legend or imagination to shape their picture of events. One noble author from a powerful Armenian family presents an especially self-serving vision, exaggerating both Mongol sympathy toward Christianity and the influence of his own relatives at court. Even so, these Armenian works are indispensable. They capture a frontier zone where Christian elites, local dynasties, and Mongol overlords were forced into constant negotiation. Their pages preserve the tension between cooperation and dependence, survival and ambition. In the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia, where the rulers became tributaries of the Mongols and sought advantage through alliance, a number of annals were composed. These works are tied to the political life of the kingdom and reflect a world in which Mongol friendship seemed, at least for a time, essential for survival. One chronicle is associated with the brother of the Cilician king, a man who had personally carried his ruler's submission to the Mongol court. Such testimony matters because it comes from people who did not merely observe the rise of Mongol power from afar, but entered into formal relations with it and built political strategy around it. A later Armenian noble, known in the West as Hayton of Gorygos, carried this outlook even further. Living in exile and writing in Latin Christian Europe, he produced a sweeping account of the East that included a survey of the Mongol world. At first glance, he seems to offer ideal credentials. He claimed access to Eastern traditions for the early history of the Mongols, family testimony for the middle phase, and personal experience for the later period. He even presents himself as someone who took part in one of the Mongol invasions of Syria. Yet the work must be handled with great care. Some of its material is plainly wrong, and some belongs more to political imagination than to sober reporting. He magnifies the honours shown to his own family, softens or ignores inconvenient changes in Mongol religious policy, and shapes the past into an argument for alliance between the Mongols of Iran and the Latin West. His history is therefore not neutral description. It is a piece of persuasion written by a man who believed that only a joint Western and Mongol front could save his homeland. The historian in him is real, but the Armenian noble and political advocate speaks even louder. When the lens shifts to Latin Christian Europe, the body of evidence becomes broader, but also more uneven. The work associated with Marco Polo remains one of the most famous descriptions of the Mongol world. Yet, it is not a straightforward travel memoir. It is a survey of lands, peoples, routes, rulers, and marvels, compiled in a form that moves freely between personal observation and second-hand information. The textual tradition is also extremely complicated, which makes certainty difficult. Still, despite the problems, the work contains many observations of real value. It reflects a European attempt to describe the Mongol world not merely as a distant threat, but as part of a connected Eurasian space that could be travelled, traded across, and, at least in theory, understood. Even more important than Polo in many respects were the friars sent east by the papacy and the missionary orders. During the middle decades of the 13th century, Franciscans and Dominicans entered Mongol territories as envoys, missionaries, and investigators. Some met Mongol generals in the Near East, while others travelled across the Great Steppe toward the courts of the Supreme Khans. Their reports are among the most valuable Western sources for the internal life of the Mongol Empire. One Dominican mission encountered Baiju in Greater Armenia and produced material that preserves rare details about Mongol dealings with the Seljuks of Anatolia. A Franciscan envoy reached the court of the Great Khan and left behind one of the clearest Western accounts of Mongol imperial organization. Another Franciscan, traveling in a missionary spirit rather than a strictly diplomatic one, wrote an exceptionally vivid and detailed account of life on the steppe and at the Mongol court. These men did not see everything, and they often misunderstood what they saw. But they recorded customs, rituals, political habits, and social practices that Muslim sources either ignore or mention only briefly. As the 13th century turned into the 14th, more friars travelled through Mongol lands. Some still carried diplomatic messages, but many were driven by the missionary ambition to win converts and establish permanent Christian institutions. Their writings reveal a world that was changing quickly. One Dominican observer active in the Near East at the end of the century described the Ilkhanate in a moment of uncertainty when the balance between religions and communities had not yet settled. The papacy, hoping both to spread Christianity and to cultivate anti-Muslim alliances, established vast ecclesiastical jurisdictions centered in key Mongol cities. One of the leading churchmen sent to the Ilkhanate later wrote a treatise on how to defeat Muslim powers, and in doing so left behind valuable information about Mongol Iran and the hopes Western Christians placed in it. Letters from friars working farther north and east reveal another side of the story: the obstacles facing missionaries in lands where Islam was advancing within Mongol society itself. In the Golden Horde and the Chagatai realm, conversion was changing the political and religious landscape, narrowing the possibilities that had once seemed open to Latin Christianity. These European Christian texts often show open hostility toward Islam, especially when written in moments when Mongol rulers or Mongol elites were moving toward the Muslim world. That hostility cannot be ignored. Yet it does not cancel their importance. In fact, their bias sometimes sharpens the very details that make them useful. They paid close attention to Mongol customs, religious ideas, court etiquette, military mobility, and habits of daily life, precisely because these things seem strange, threatening, or strategically significant. In that sense, they provide something that many Persian and Arabic narratives do not. Muslim historians often give a strong event-driven account filled with campaigns, rulers, battles, decrees, and political turns. The friars and travellers, by contrast, often pause over the texture of Mongol life itself. They describe the people behind the campaigns, the beliefs behind the policies, and the world behind the armies. Together, these Christian sources from Armenia, the Eastern churches, and Latin Europe reveal how unstable and contested the early Mongol period truly was for Christian communities. Under some rulers, churches rose in influence and Christian officials moved with confidence near the centre of power. Under others, or under changing local conditions, those same communities faced hostility, disappointment, and violence. Some writers remembered the Mongols as protectors who broke old restrictions. Others saw only the collapse of those hopes, once political winds shifted. In nearly every case, Christian authors wrote, with strong motives of their own. Some wanted to defend a church leader, some wanted to exalt a dynasty, some wanted to persuade Western rulers to launch a crusade, and some wanted to support missionary strategy. None of them wrote in a vacuum. That is exactly what makes them so valuable. They do not offer a simple or unified Christian view of the Mongol age. Instead, they reveal a fractured landscape of expectation, fear, calculation, and adaptation. Armenian nobles looked to Mongol alliance as a shield against their enemies. Eastern churchmen saw periods of privilege followed by decline. Latin envoys tried to understand a power that might be converted, befriended, or turned into an ally. Missionaries searched for souls but also gathered intelligence. Travellers described what they saw with curiosity, anxiety, and sometimes wonder. Across all of these texts runs the same underlying reality. The Mongol Empire was not only a military force, but a vast zone of contact where faiths, languages, loyalties, and ambitions collided. When Chingis Khan's armies crossed into Islamic lands in 1219, the Muslim world was not encountering the peoples of the Eurasian steppe for the first time. Contact between the settled societies of the Middle East and the nomadic world to the north and east stretched back many centuries. From Manchuria to Hungary, across grasslands that changed, from dry and stony plains in the east to rich, river-fed pasture in the west, generations of mobile herders had lived by the rhythms of migration. They raised horses above all, but also sheep, goats, cattle, and camels, moving with the seasons between high summer pasture and sheltered winter ground. By the time early Muslim armies moved through the Caucasus and crossed the Oxus into Transoxiana, the peoples they encountered in these frontier zones were already mostly Turkic. Earlier political structures had tied many of them to the old western branch of the Turkic steppe empire, while farther north the Khazars dominated the lands beyond the Caucasus and the Caspian, blocking Muslim expansion in that direction. East of the Caspian, however, the frontier proved more open. Muslim armies pushed into Transoxiana, and their hold on the region was strengthened both by the fragmented nature of steppe politics there, and by the weakening of Chinese influence after the defeat of a Tang force near Talas. That early momentum did not continue forever. The steppe did not yield easily, and the pastoral confederations beyond the frontier proved stubborn and resilient. Towns on the outer edge of the Islamic world remained frontier strongholds for generations, rather than gateways to limitless expansion. At the same time, political unity inside the Islamic world began to fragment. The caliph in Baghdad remained an important symbol, but real power increasingly passed into the hands of regional dynasties. In the east, the Samanids ruled Transoxiana and Khorasan from Bukhara, and used warfare against non-Muslim Turkic peoples as a source of legitimacy. Under their protection, Muslim communities spread farther into frontier territory, and from the end of the 9th century, onward Islam resumed its gradual expansion across Central Asia. This was not simply a military process. Merchants, settlers, scholars, and administrators all played their part in extending the Muslim presence into regions once considered beyond the edge of the civilized world. North and east of the Samanid domains lay immense territories still seen as part of a hostile outer zone. In the northwestern steppe and the forest belt of western Siberia, large tribal groupings dominated a world where Islam had barely made an impression. Some of these peoples had begun to combine nomadic life with agriculture, but they remained outside the religious orbit of the Islamic world. After the collapse of Khazar power, the steppe west of the Volga also passed into the hands of peoples who were only lightly touched by Islam. One important exception stood out in the middle Volga region, where the Bulgars established a Muslim state, ruled by a Turkic elite, over a largely Finno-Ugric population. Their ruler accepted Islam in the early 10th century, and by the end of that century, their capital had become a major centre in the trade, linking the northern forests to Khwarezm, Transoxiana, and the Middle East. Islam took deep root there, and over time the Volga Bulgars became known as an especially strict Muslim society, even by the standards of later visitors from the wider Islamic world. Farther east, Islam faced powerful rivals. In Mongolia and the neighbouring regions, the dominant Uyghurs had embraced Manichaeism as a state religion in the 8th century. Later, after the fall of their empire, Buddhism rather than Islam became the main faith to advance among the semi-settled Uyghur communities of Central Asia. For Muslims, Buddhism appeared as one of the great religious alternatives on the eastern frontier, and it often seemed inseparable from the wider political power of Inner Asia. Christianity also spread across these lands, though not evenly. Greek Christianity made only limited gains beyond Khwarezm, and smaller Western Syrian communities existed in scattered places. By contrast, the Church of the East built a far broader presence. It established ecclesiastical centres among Turkic peoples and expanded into Kashgar, Almalai, and even farther across the steppe. Through these missionary efforts, Christianity reached tribal confederations that would later play major roles in steppe politics. By the 11th and 12th centuries, important groups in Inner Asia had Christian rulers, or at least strong Christian elements within their elites. Meanwhile, the Islamic world was not only confronting the peoples of the steppe from outside, it was also absorbing them from within. Turkic youths captured in frontier warfare were sent into Muslim service as military slaves, converted to Islam, trained in warfare, and used as palace guards and soldiers. Over time, this system transformed the politics of the Islamic world. Provincial rulers imitated the caliph by building their own corps of slave soldiers, and before long, Turkic commanders began founding dynasties of their own. Yet Turks did not enter Islamic lands only as captives. Free nomadic groups who'd already accepted Islam also served Muslim states as auxiliaries. In time, conversion among Turkic peoples began to accelerate, especially in the regions just east of Transoxiana. Muslim communities had already appeared among the Karluk and Oghuz peoples by the late 10th century, and some Oghuz Muslims began to be known by the name Turkmen. The real turning point came with the rise of the Kara-Khanids. Their conversion helped push Islam deeper into Central Asia and made possible a new kind of frontier expansion. The exact path of that conversion remains unclear, but closer contact with Muslim rulers, merchants, and urban centres almost certainly played a role. Rather than wandering mystics acting alone, the more likely agents were practical figures such as jurists, scholars, and traders. Among nomadic peoples, Islam was not only a religion but also a bridge into profitable commercial and political networks. Muslim merchants carried prestige, and ties with them offered clear advantages. In this atmosphere, ruling houses could gain both legitimacy and opportunity by entering the Islamic fold. Once conversion gathered pace, the settled regions of the Eastern Islamic world began to receive large migrations of newly Muslim Turkic nomads. The Kara-Khanids took Transoxiana and brought an end to the old Samanid order. Soon after, the Seljuks emerged from the Oghuz world north of the Sir Darya. At first allowed into Khorasan by the Ghaznavids, they quickly turned from guests into rivals. Their victory at Dandankan opened the way for the loss of eastern Iran by the Ghaznavids and the rise of a vast Seljuk empire stretching across Iran, Iraq, and Anatolia. When the Seljuk leader entered Baghdad and received the title of Sultan, the political balance of the Islamic world changed decisively. Here were rulers only recently converted to Islam, now acting as protectors of the caliph and masters of the central lands of the Muslim world. Their new faith softened, though it did not erase the violence that accompanied their rise. Military success carried Islam outward in different directions. The Seljuks pushed west into Anatolia, while the Kara-Khanids fought their non-Muslim neighbours in the east and extended Muslim influence toward Khotan and the lands around the Ili. Their grand titles reflected this widening horizon. Under their rule, cities like Kashgar and Balasagun became fully integrated into the Islamic world, and by the 12th and early 13th centuries, these towns were centres of legal learning and religious scholarship. The eastern frontier of Islam was no longer only a line of forts and raids. It had become a zone of settled Muslim culture, urban life, and intellectual production. Yet the Seljuks adapted in ways the Kara-Khanids did not. Guided by Persian ministers and Iranian traditions of kingship, they ruled from courts steeped in Persian language and culture. Their political style became increasingly detached from the tribal masses that had carried them to power. Instead of relying only on nomadic followers, they built stronger states with slave soldiers, provincial governors, and bureaucratic administration. In time, as Seljuk authority weakened, governors and military commanders turned provinces into hereditary domains. Dynasties like the Eldeguzids and the Khwarezm Shahs emerged from this process, rising on the foundations laid by the slave military system and the fragmentation of older imperial power. Muslim writers had been describing the lands beyond the Islamic frontier since at least the 9th century. Their knowledge was imperfect, and they often misunderstood the beliefs of distant peoples. But on the whole, they showed remarkable awareness of steppe customs. They described tent-dwelling nomads who lived on meat and mare's milk, excelled in warfare, and seemed inseparable from their horses. For many Muslim authors, the Turk became a recognizable type: resilient, fierce, skilled in archery, dangerous in war, but capable, once converted, of becoming one of Islam's strongest defenders. This image grew into a literary theme. Writers praised the toughness and military discipline of Turks, especially those who entered the Islamic world as slave soldiers and rose to positions of great power. Proverbs compared them to pearls whose true value appeared only once they left their native lands. At the same time, Turks entered Persian epic imagination in another form. In the great Iranian heroic tradition, the peoples of Turan had long stood as the enemies of Iran. These legendary Turanians were not in fact the Turks of the medieval steppe, yet in later centuries they were increasingly identified with them. Rulers of Turkic origin themselves began to claim descent from heroic figures of Iranian legend, blending Persian literary prestige with Turkic political identity. This fusion became one of the most striking features of Islamic Central Asia, where newly converted rulers embraced Persian culture, even while asserting their place as sons of the steppe. There was, however, a darker current in Muslim thought about the peoples beyond the frontier. Beyond the known world of the north and east lay the terrifying lands associated with Gog and Magog, the peoples who in Islamic and biblical tradition would burst forth at the end of time. Their path, it was believed, had been blocked by a mighty barrier built in antiquity by Alexander. The farther reaches of Inner Asia remained so poorly understood that travellers and storytellers could imagine them as the edge of the apocalyptic world itself. Some writers treated the Turks as the advance line of those final destructive peoples. Others warned against provoking them, repeating traditions that described them as a scourge God might unleash against sinful Muslims. These ideas became far more immediate once Muslim populations in Central Asia and beyond began to face conquest by non-Muslim nomads. Large changes in the Western steppe added to the pressure. During the 11th century, a chain of migrations sent shockwaves across Inner Asia and beyond. The result was the rise of a vast and loose Chipchak confederation that took over the lands of older steppe peoples, from the lower Syr Darya to the Dnieper. In Western sources, these same peoples became known by names like Cumans and Polovtsi. Their eastern allies or rivals included the Kangli, who controlled territories between the Syr Darya and the Ural. Other tribal movements pushed groups such as the Naiman farther west, while newer elements entered the Volga-Ural zone and reshaped the politics of the whole region. Much about these migrations remains obscure, but they were clearly linked to wider developments in East Asia, including the rise of the Tangut state and the shifting fortunes of the Khitan, whose empire once ruled Mongolia and northern China. The Khitan would soon bring the world of Inner Asia even closer to the Islamic frontier. After their eastern empire fell to the Yurchen, a branch of the old imperial family moved west and carved out a new empire in Central Asia. In Muslim sources, these rulers became known as the Kara-Khitai. Their sovereign ruled with titles drawn from both Chinese and Inner Asian traditions and imposed authority over a mixed world of Uyghurs, Karluks, Karakhanids, and Muslims of Transoxiana. When the Seljuk Sultan Sanjar tried to resist them, he suffered a crushing defeat. Thereafter, the Karakhanid princes and the Khwarazm Shahs alike were forced to acknowledge Kara-Khitai overlordship. This new empire had major consequences. It not only imposed tribute on Muslim lands, but also triggered fresh movements of nomadic peoples into Khorasan and beyond. In the power vacuum that followed, Sanjar's authority collapsed and eastern Iran fractured. The Ghurids rose from the mountains east of Herat and expanded into Khorasan and northern India. At the same time, the Khwarazm Shahs, once subordinate rulers on the lower Oxus, also grew in strength. Their rivalry with the Ghurids shaped the politics of the Eastern Islamic world in the years just before the Mongols appeared. To later Muslim authors, the Kara-Khitai seemed like an ominous prelude to the Mongol disaster. Unlike many Turkic dynasties that had already converted to Islam, their ruling elite remained outside the faith. Their state blended Khitan and Chinese traditions rather than Muslim ones, and their coins and court culture reflected that heritage. Yet their rule was not initially harsh. In many places, Muslim urban life continued with surprisingly little disruption. Local administrators remained in place, tax demands were often moderate, and Muslim culture flourished under their loose supremacy. Some writers even praised the justice of the early Kara-Khitai rulers. The Muslim learned class did not vanish under them, and leading local families in places like Bukhara retained influence. Their empire was religiously mixed and politically pragmatic. The ruling house likely combined steppe ritual traditions with Buddhism and showed favour to holy men of several religions, including Islam and Christianity. Only in later years, when their power came under strain and new outside pressures mounted, did their rule become heavier and more repressive. The arrival of Naiman refugees, the seizure of power by Gushuluk, and growing hostility toward Muslim religious figures made the final phase of Kara-Khitai rule far more bitter than the earlier one. Even so, their very existence posed a serious challenge to the Islamic world. Large territories that had once been part of the realm of Islam were now under non-Muslim sovereignty. When the Khwarezm Shah Muhammad later broke with Kara-Khitai overlordship and overthrew their authority, many Muslim writers celebrated the event. But in retrospect, the triumph looked far more troubling. Several later historians argued that the Kara-Khitai had served as a barrier standing between the Muslim world and something even worse. By destroying their power and by eliminating other states that stood between the steppe and Iran, Muhammad had unknowingly opened the road for Chingis Khan. That same Khwarezmian world had also been deeply entangled with the Chipchak and Kongli of the steppe. These nomadic peoples lived just beyond the Sirdarya frontier, and their relations with Muslim rulers shifted constantly between warfare, raiding, alliance, and marriage. Khwarezm Shahs attacked them repeatedly, but they also recruited them. One of the most important of these alliances came when Tekish married a Chipchak princess, remembered as Terken Khatun. Through her, large numbers of Chipchak tribesmen entered Khwarezmian service, and her relatives rose to high office. Under her son Muhammad, these connections became even more significant. Chipchak troops were central to the expansion of the Khwarezmian state, but their brutality also helped spread the image of Khwarezmian rule as harsh and predatory. Their loyalty was uncertain, and steppe politics remained unstable beneath the surface of royal marriages and military service. The ethnic names in the sources are often confusing. Tribes overlapped, merged, split, and acquired new names in new places. Older group names survived in new political settings, and some labels were used very broadly. Muslim writers frequently use the term Tatar in the same loose way, applying it not only to one tribe in Mongolia, but to many peoples of the eastern steppe. Over time, as the Mongols rose, the name Tatar spread even more widely and became the common term by which many outsiders referred to them. The rise of the Mongols themselves remains partly hidden in darkness. It is difficult to trace how peoples of different origins gradually came together in eastern Inner Asia and eventually formed what would become the Mongol nation. But once Temujin began his climb to power, the picture becomes much clearer. In the later 12th century, the Mongols were only one small people among many in the region. Around them stood stronger and more established powers. The Tatars in the east, the Merkit near Lake Baikal, the Ongut farther south, the Kereyit in the river valleys of central Mongolia, and the Naiman in the west, near the Altai and Upper Irtish. Some of these groups had sophisticated political hierarchies with hereditary khans, while others remained more loosely organized. Temujin's early life was marked by catastrophe. After his father was poisoned by Tatars, his family was abandoned and reduced to hardship. Their world shrank from the open steppe to a struggle for survival. His recovery began when he gathered loyal companions from different backgrounds and attached himself to Togril, the Kereyit ruler, who had once been close to his father. With Togril's support, Temujin defeated rivals, gathered followers, and rose among the Mongols. Together they turned against the Tatars, and after gaining support from the Jin rulers of northern China, they destroyed them with extraordinary violence. That alliance did not last. Tension with Togril and his son led to open war, and Temujin destroyed the Karaite as well. He then moved against the Naiman and the Merkit, defeating them in turn and absorbing much of their people into his growing power. In 1206, an assembly of tribal leaders proclaimed him supreme ruler of the peoples of the felt tents and gave him the title Chingis Khan. Whatever the exact meaning of that title, it marked the beginning of a new imperial order. He was no longer simply leader of one tribe among many. He now claimed command over the nomadic world itself. This new empire did not emerge from nothing. It drew on older Inner Asian political traditions, especially the belief that heaven granted a special force or fortune to one chosen ruling line. It also connected itself to earlier imperial centres of the steppe. The Orkhon Valley, later linked to Karakorum, held deep prestige because older Turkic and Uyghur empires had centred power there. By choosing this region as the base for his great western campaign, Chingis Khan was not merely selecting a useful encampment. He was placing himself within the geography of sacred rule and imperial memory. From that ground, the armies of the steppe would soon move westward into a world that had known the nomads for centuries, but had never yet faced a power like this. The state built by Chingis Khan marked a turning point in the political history of the steppe. Earlier nomadic empires had claimed authority over tribes and pasture lands, but this new power reached far beyond that horizon. Its rulers began to present themselves as chosen by the sky to rule not just the nomads, but all lands under heaven. This idea gave the Mongol state a new kind of confidence and direction. At the same time, it was not only an ideology. The structure of the empire itself was more tightly bound together than anything that had come before it on the steppe. At the centre of this system stood the ruler's own household and his elite guard. This was not simply a body of warriors assigned to protect a leader. It was the core of government. These men carried out administrative tasks, enforced decisions, and ensured that authority flowed directly from the ruler. Many of them were companions who had risen through loyalty and ability, rather than noble birth. Others were sons of tribal leaders and officers, bound to the ruler both by service and by obligation. In this way, the empire created a new elite whose identity depended not on tribe, but on allegiance to the ruling house. The military structure followed older patterns, dividing forces into units based on tens, hundreds, and thousands. But the way these units were organized changed everything. Tribes that had once acted as independent powers were deliberately broken apart and redistributed among mixed formations. Commanders were often chosen from outside the original tribal structure, ensuring that loyalty was directed upward rather than inward. The distribution of spoils also shifted. Instead of concentrating wealth in the hands of clan leaders, rewards were shared more widely among ordinary warriors. This gave individuals a chance to rise through merit, and tied their fortunes directly to the success of the empire. These changes had lasting consequences. Earlier, steppe empires had often fallen apart when powerful tribes broke away and reasserted their independence. The Mongol state resisted this pattern. When it eventually divided, it did so along dynastic and territorial lines, rather than tribal ones. The ruling family remained at the centre of power across multiple regions, and even when strong military leaders emerged, they continued to govern in the name of that dynasty. This sense of legitimacy proved remarkably durable, and shaped political life across much of Eurasia for generations. The Mongols were also pragmatic in how they built their system. They adopted ideas and practices from the peoples they defeated or absorbed. Some of their military structures had already appeared among neighbouring steppe groups. Administrative methods came from more settled societies. A key development was the adoption of writing for official use. Skilled individuals from conquered peoples introduced systems of record-keeping, taxation, and communication. Through these innovations, the Mongols created a functioning imperial administration capable of managing vast territories. As their power expanded across the eastern steppe, it also set off new waves of movement. Some defeated groups did not submit, but instead fled westward. Leaders of these displaced peoples sought refuge in distant regions, bringing instability with them. Others found opportunities to align themselves with the rising Mongol power. Some local rulers broke away from existing overlords and declared their loyalty to Chingis Khan. In return, they were rewarded with recognition, protection, and sometimes marriage alliances that bound them closely to the imperial family. These developments gradually extended Mongol influence into regions that bordered the Islamic world. At first, the Mongols appeared as just another wave of steppe forces, little different from earlier groups. Their enemies and allies alike often referred to them by familiar names, used for steppe peoples in general. But beneath that surface, something new was taking shape. The consolidation of power in the east, combined with the displacement of rival tribes, pushed Mongol forces closer to the great settled civilizations of Central Asia. Despite their growing strength, the steppe peoples did not live in isolation from the settled world. They depended on it in many ways. They needed metal for weapons, textiles, and goods that could not be produced in a nomadic economy. Trade routes crossing the steppe became lifelines, and nomadic leaders often protected merchants in exchange for wealth. At the same time, they were cautious. Settled life held both attraction and danger. Many believed that abandoning the steppe would weaken the very qualities that made them strong. Traditions warned against becoming too comfortable, too dependent, or too distant from the harsh environment that had shaped their identity. These tensions created a unique balance. The steppe and the city remained deeply connected, yet fundamentally different. Nomadic societies could borrow tools, techniques, and knowledge, but they resisted adopting the full way of life of the settled world. This distinction would remain important as the Mongols expanded into regions filled with cities, farms, and long-established traditions. By the early 13th century, the Eastern Islamic world had grown used to dealing with steppe powers. It had faced waves of migration, seen nomadic groups convert to Islam, and even experienced periods of rule by non-Muslim forces. But none of this prepared it for what was about to come. The rise of the Mongols brought a scale of organization and ambition that surpassed anything seen before. Information about them had already spread westward. Traders, envoys, and travelers carried news of their victories and their methods. Fear began to take hold even before the armies themselves appeared. When the first direct conflict came, it was triggered by a violent incident. A group of merchants and envoys travelling between Mongol territory and the Khwarezmian Empire were seized and killed in a frontier city. Their goods were taken and their mission was denounced as espionage. Whether they were spies or simply traders, the act broke the fragile connection between the two powers. A demand for justice followed, and when that too ended in bloodshed, the path to war was set. Yet this was not the only cause, and trade itself lay at the heart of the relationship. The flow of goods across Central Asia had always been a source of tension and opportunity. When routes were blocked or restricted, conflict often followed. The Mongols depended on access to luxury goods and materials from the settled world, and they took steps to protect and encourage commerce within their own territories. The destruction of a trading mission was therefore more than an isolated crime. It was a direct challenge to a system that the Mongols considered essential. Other factors also played a role. Political changes in Central Asia had already brought Mongol influence closer to the borders of the Khwarezmian state. Rivalries, territorial expansion, and shifting alliances all contributed to an atmosphere of tension. Some even believed that distant rulers had encouraged the Mongols to attack their enemies, though such claims are difficult to verify. What is clear is that by the time the conflict began, the two powers were already on a collision course. The Mongols did not initially present themselves as conquerors of the entire world. Their early ambitions were rooted in steppe traditions. But as their victories multiplied, their outlook began to change. Success itself reshaped their goals. As they moved into new regions, they adapted quickly. They appointed officials in captured cities, gathered information about local customs, and made use of skilled administrators. Their presence was not temporary. It was the beginning of a new order. The invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire unfolded with remarkable speed and coordination. The Mongol forces advanced along multiple routes, targeting key cities and strategic positions. Instead of facing a united army in open battle, they encountered scattered resistance. The Khwarezmian ruler chose to divide his forces among fortified cities, rather than risk a decisive confrontation. This decision proved disastrous. It allowed the Mongols to isolate and overwhelm each center one by one. Some cities surrendered quickly, hoping to avoid destruction. Others resisted and paid a heavy price. The pattern repeated itself across the region. Where resistance was strong, the response was severe. Where submission came early, the outcome could be less destructive. The fall of major cities marked turning points in the campaign. Once the main centers of power were broken, the rest of the empire began to collapse. Meanwhile, Mongol commanders pursued the fleeing ruler across vast distances. Their movements carried them far beyond the original theatre of war. They entered new lands, defeated local forces, and extended their reach into regions that had never before faced such an invasion. In the west, they clashed with forces from the Caucasus and beyond, pushing into territories that would later become part of their expanding world. At the same time, other Mongol forces moved through Khorasan, securing cities and eliminating resistance. These campaigns were systematic. They aimed not only to defeat armies, but to dismantle the structures of power that supported them. By the time the main phase of the invasion ended, the Khwarezmian state had effectively ceased to exist. One figure continued to resist. The son of the defeated ruler gathered forces and fought back with determination. For a brief moment, he achieved success against Mongol detachments. But the balance of power was overwhelming. In a final confrontation near a great river, his army was destroyed. He escaped, but his cause was lost. The Mongols had secured their victory. After the campaign, the conqueror did not immediately press deeper into the west. Instead, he turned back toward the heart of his empire. The journey home was long and deliberate, marked by pauses in key regions and the gathering of leaders. Decisions about succession and future campaigns were made along the way. In the years that followed, further wars would continue the expansion. But the foundation had already been laid. The death of Chingis Khan did not end the momentum. After a brief period of uncertainty, a new ruler was chosen and the structure of the empire continued to evolve. Titles, institutions, and administrative practices reflected a growing sense of imperial identity. What had begun as a union of steppe tribes had become something far greater. A state capable of conquering and governing vast regions across continents. By this stage, the transformation was complete. The Mongol state was no longer just a power of the steppe. It had become a force that reshaped the political landscape of Eurasia, linking distant regions through conquest, administration, and exchange. The world that had once seen the steppe as a distant frontier was now facing a power that would redefine its boundaries. After years of chaos in the lands of the Indus, Jalal al-Din turned back toward Iran, crossing harsh deserts and gathering what remained of his strength. Around him, scattered loyalists began to regroup. Veterans of his father's rule, displaced officers, and wandering troops rallied once more under his banner. For a moment, it seemed possible that something of the old Khwarezmian power might rise again. But his ambitions unfolded in a world that had already changed beyond recognition. Rather than confronting the Mongols directly, he turned much of his energy against neighbouring rulers. Campaigns were launched into regions held by Christian Georgia and rival Muslim dynasties. He defeated some, overthrew others, but failed to create anything stable in their place. Even where he triumphed, the gains slipped quickly through his fingers. Against the Mongols themselves, his efforts were limited and uncertain. A single clash near a major city forced the enemy to withdraw for a time, but it did not alter the balance of power. Meanwhile, far to the east, a decision was made that would seal his fate. A new ruler had taken control of the Mongol Empire, and with him came renewed determination to finish what had begun. Fresh forces were sent westward, not as raiders passing through, but as troops meant to stay. These were garrison soldiers, drawn from many different peoples, settled permanently in frontier regions. Their purpose was not only to fight, but to hold territory, enforce authority, and extend the reach of the empire. The man placed in command of these forces moved steadily across Iran, securing strongholds and suppressing resistance. His mission was clear: eliminate what remained of Khwarezmian power. Former commanders of Jalal al-Din were hunted down and defeated. Some fled into remote fortresses, others vanished into the chaos. One by one, the last fragments of organized resistance were crushed. Jalal al-Din himself was forced into retreat. As Mongol forces advanced into the lands he still controlled, he found himself outmaneuvered and isolated. His end came not in battle, but at the hands of a local bandit, far from the grandeur of the kingship he had once claimed. With his death, the last hope of restoring his father's empire disappeared. The men who had followed him did not vanish. Instead, they drifted across the region, offering their swords to whoever would pay, becoming a restless and unpredictable force in the struggles that followed. With no major enemy left to oppose them, the Mongols moved swiftly to secure their new domains. Cities across Azerbaijan and the surrounding regions submitted. A base of power was established in the northwest, from which further campaigns could be launched. Neighbouring lands soon felt the pressure. Armenia and Georgia were brought under control, their rulers forced into submission. In these early years, Mongol operations remained focused on this northern arc, but their influence was spreading in all directions. In the south, rulers chose a different path. Some preferred submission to destruction. They sent envoys, acknowledged Mongol authority, and were allowed to retain their positions. This was a pattern that would repeat itself across many regions. Those who resisted faced devastation. Those who submitted could survive, though under the shadow of a distant power. As control tightened over Iran, the Mongols began to push further west. Raiding forces probed into Iraq, testing defences and searching for weaknesses. Cities that had once escaped earlier campaigns now found themselves exposed. Attempts were made to organise resistance, but they were fragmented and ineffective. Even when armies gathered, they struggled to stand against the speed and coordination of the Mongol advance. A change in leadership did not slow this momentum. A new commander took charge of operations and brought fresh energy to the campaign. He led an invasion into Anatolia, striking at one of the strongest states in the region. The result was decisive. the ruling power there was broken and reduced to dependence. What had once been a major force became a client, paying tribute and acknowledging Mongol supremacy. At the same time, Mongol forces entered Syria. Their arrival triggered a chain reaction. Displaced fighters moved south, entering new conflicts and reshaping the balance of power. Local rulers, faced with this new threat, chose submission rather than destruction. One after another, they accepted Mongol authority, sending tribute and envoys to secure their position. Despite these successes, one major prize remained beyond their grasp. The central authority in Baghdad continued to resist. Attempts to break it failed, and the Mongol advance in that direction slowed. There were moments of tension, rumors of great armies, and preparations for future conflict. But for the time being, the region held. Elsewhere, another campaign unfolded with devastating effect. To the north, Mongol armies swept across the steppe, destroying a long-established state and bringing its lands under their control. From there, they moved into Eastern Europe, defeating local rulers and pushing deep into new territories. Cities were destroyed, kingdoms shaken, and vast regions were drawn into the expanding network of Mongol power. These victories were not the result of overwhelming numbers. In many cases, the Mongols were outnumbered by their enemies. Their strength lay elsewhere. They moved faster, planned better, and communicated more effectively than any force they faced. Their armies could operate over great distances, coordinating movements with precision. They gathered intelligence through traders, spies, and defectors, often knowing their enemies' weaknesses before a battle began. Discipline was another key. Orders were strict, and disobedience was punished harshly. Soldiers were trained to act as part of a larger system, not as individuals seeking personal gain. Even the distribution of plunder was controlled, ensuring that victory came before profit. This created a force that was unified in purpose and capable of sustained campaigns across vast regions. They also made use of fear. Rumors of their strength spread ahead of them, often exaggerated by design. Captured populations were sometimes forced to march with the army, giving the impression of even greater numbers. Cities that resisted and were destroyed became warnings to others. In many cases, this alone was enough to secure surrender without a fight. Unlike earlier nomadic powers, they were also skilled in siege warfare. They brought with them engineers, craftsmen, and techniques learned from more advanced societies. Fortified cities that might once have resisted steppe armies now fell under sustained assault. Walls were breached, defences overcome, and strongholds that seemed secure were taken one after another. Yet perhaps the most striking feature of this expansion was the number of allies the Mongols attracted. Their armies were not made up solely of steppe warriors. From the beginning, they drew support from local rulers, discontented commanders, merchants, and even ordinary people seeking advantage or revenge. Some joined willingly, others out of necessity. Together, they formed a force that grew stronger with each conquest. These allies came from many backgrounds. Some were rulers seeking protection or opportunity. Others were former enemies of the Khwarezmian state, eager to settle old scores. Merchants provided intelligence and support, benefiting from the stability that Mongol rule could bring to trade routes. Even groups that had once resisted the Mongols found themselves drawn into their system. Over time, all of these different peoples were absorbed into a single structure. They served under Mongol command, followed Mongol discipline, and became part of the same military machine. Identity began to shift. What mattered was not origin, but allegiance. Those who served the empire were, in a political sense, transformed into part of it. This transformation extended beyond the battlefield. New customs were imposed, symbols of submission adopted, and distinctions between conqueror and conquered began to blur. Service in the Mongol system brought both obligations and opportunities. Those who adapted could rise, gaining status and influence within the expanding empire. By the middle of the century, a vast and diverse world had been drawn together under a single authority. From the cities of China to the plains of Eastern Europe, from the deserts of Iran to the mountains of Anatolia, regions that had once been separate were now linked. Trade flowed more freely, ideas travelled further, and new connections were forged. When Chingis Khan died, he left behind something far greater than a victorious steppe confederation. His heirs now controlled an immense realm reaching from northern China and the edge of Korea to Khwarezm and the lands beyond the Aral Sea, and from the forests of Siberia to the mountains south of Transoxiana and the Iranian plateau. Under his successors, that realm would grow even larger. Yet size alone did not make it a single, unified state in any modern sense. The early Mongol Empire was held together by conquest, kinship, movement, and military discipline, but it ruled very different landscapes and populations in very different ways. The central question was not simply how much land the Mongols had conquered, but how they managed to command it, extract wealth from it, reward loyal service, and keep expansion going across distances so vast that many of their subjects lived thousands of miles from the Mongol heartland. In some ways, the empire created by Chingis Khan built on earlier Inner Asian traditions. Earlier dynasties such as the Liao and the Jin had already governed mixed populations and had learned how to tax settled agricultural societies, especially in northern China. They were not limited to raiding, tribute, or profits from trade, although those still mattered. Yet those earlier powers usually kept separate systems for steppe peoples and sedentary populations. The Mongols moved in a different direction. They brought into their service men from many backgrounds, including peoples already used to ruling diverse societies. They employed administrators and soldiers from the world of the Kara-Khitai, the Jurchen Jin, and the Tangut kingdom. They also relied on groups whose roots were nomadic, but who had already become partly settled, such as the Uyghurs, the Onguts, and the Khitan. Some of the most capable advisors in Chinese affairs came from this world. At the same time, Muslim secretaries, merchants, and officials from Central Asia, Khwarezm, and Iran entered Mongol service in large numbers. In lands south of the steppe, especially China, Transoxiana, and much of Iran, the Mongols did something more ambitious than their predecessors. Rather than preserving separate traditions side by side, they began to combine them into a broader and more flexible structure of rule. This empire was never simple. It was a layered and uneven dominion made up of mobile rulers, conquered cities, tribute zones, military colonies, princely territories, tax districts, and trade routes. In the earliest years, the Mongols still depended heavily on plunder, tribute, and control of long-distance commerce. But under Ögedei and the rulers who followed him, they gained far more direct access to the wealth of settled populations. They preserved many of the tax systems they found in conquered states and blended them with older steppe practices and borrowed institutions. Some taxes came from traditions already known among the Uyghurs. The famous tablets that granted official authority to travel on state business were adapted from earlier models used by northern dynasties. The relay networks of post stations that linked court, army, and province were inherited from defeated powers and then expanded on a vast scale. By the middle decades of the 13th century, this communication system stretched across enormous distances from East Asia deep into Central Asia and beyond, allowing messages, orders, and envoys to move with surprising speed. Yet for all the wealth of cities and farming regions now under Mongol domination, the empire in this early period was still ruled in the style of a nomadic power. Its political centre was not a fixed capital in the usual sense, but the moving court of the ruling house. The Khagan and his relatives governed from their great encampments, each of them a travelling world of tents, retainers, animals, wagons, officials, and guards. Contemporary observers compared some of these encampments to cities in motion. Even Karakorum, later remembered as a Mongol capital, functioned less as a permanent seat of government than as one important centre among several seasonal residences. It served as a storehouse, a workshop centre, and a place where the ruler might reside for a time, but it did not replace the mobile political habits of the dynasty. In this respect, the Mongols resembled other steppe-born ruling houses that had long remained attached to their tents, even after conquering wealthy urban regions. The same steppe character also shaped how supreme power was transmitted. Only members of the imperial lineage possessed the sacred prestige required for sovereignty. Beyond that, there was no fixed law of succession in the modern dynastic sense. The ideal candidate was expected to be experienced, capable in war, respected by the ruling family, and wise enough to lead. In practice, this usually favoured older and more seasoned princes, though it was never entirely clear whether seniority meant age or closeness of descent from a common ancestor. At the same time, reigning rulers tried to influence the future by naming preferred successors. In theory, consensus among the ruling family mattered greatly. In practice, force often settled what custom left uncertain. A prince who could seize power and defend it might prevail, even if such a seizure could later be described as unlawful by his enemies. The problem of succession became serious as soon as Chingis Khan himself approached death. His eldest son, Jochi, died before him, removing one obvious claimant, but leaving behind a powerful branch of the dynasty. According to several major traditions, Chingis selected Ogodei as heir, even though he was not the eldest surviving son. Chakadai still lived, and Tolui, the youngest son by the chief wife, also stood close to power. Different historical traditions place Ogodei's nomination at different moments, either before the Western campaigns or near the conqueror's death. When Ogodei was finally raised to the throne, there was still visible support for Tolui, who had acted as regent during the interregnum. This alone shows that succession was not automatic. It had to be negotiated, accepted, and staged through assembly and ceremony. Later generations struggled to justify whichever outcome had favoured their own branch of the family. Some traditions insisted that Chingis Khan had personally and clearly designated Ogodei. Others questioned whether this was later invention, shaped by historians more familiar with settled monarchies in which succession by nomination seemed natural. Yet, even if some details were later reshaped, the political memory of such a nomination mattered greatly. Written pledges were said to have existed, and arguments over what had been promised or sworn returned again and again in later disputes. Every victorious faction claimed that law, custom, and the founder's will stood on its side. Every defeated faction was later portrayed as distorting the truth. The tension deepened after the rise of the Toluid branch. Some narratives developed after the overthrow of Ogodei's family tried to make Tolui seem the rightful centre of the dynasty from the beginning. Claims of this kind often blurred the distinction between the rights of the youngest son as guardian of the ancestral hearth and the right to rule the empire as a whole. In steppe tradition, the youngest son often inherited the family homeland and core encampment. That did not necessarily mean he was heir to universal sovereignty. Yet later, histories sometimes merged the two ideas, suggesting that Tolui had possessed a stronger claim than he actually did. These accounts also enlarge the scale of his inheritance, especially in military terms, in ways that seem politically motivated. If Tolui and his descendants had really held such overwhelming superiority from the start, it would be difficult to explain how Ogedei and Guyug govern at all. The rewriting of memory after later victories is impossible to ignore. After Ogedei's death, the empire entered a period of severe uncertainty. His widow governed as regent during a long interregnum, and the throne remained contested for years. Guyug eventually emerged as Khagan, but not without tension, and not because clear primogeniture had yet been established. Senior princes, widows, regents, and rival branches all maneuvered for advantage. The old brother of Chingis Khan, known as Temujin, one of the senior surviving figures of the dynasty, even attempted to seize power for himself and was later executed. Rumors of wider conflict spread across the Islamic world, showing how unstable the center had become. What followed was not orderly succession, but prolonged political struggle disguised in the language of tradition. Batu, the leading prince of Jochi's line, played a decisive role in these years. He had become immensely powerful in the western steppes after the great campaigns into the lands of the Sipchaks and the Rus. Yet because of lingering doubts over Jochi's birth, his branch does not seem to have been treated as fully eligible for the supreme throne. Batu therefore aimed less at taking the imperial title than at preventing enemies from holding it. He strongly opposed Guyug and used delay and obstruction to slow his enthronement. Even after accepting the outcome, relations between the two remained hostile. Open war nearly followed, and only Guyug's death prevented it. Batu then seized the chance to place on the throne a candidate more acceptable to him, namely Monkey, eldest son of Tolui. The election that followed was not merely a family adjustment, it was a political revolution. The rise of Monkey came with bloodshed. The rival branches of the dynasty were divided among themselves, and Guyug's widow could not unite her supporters behind a single heir. Yet the descendants of Ogedei and Chagadai still had both motive and strength to resist Monkey. Several accounts describe a conspiracy to attack the new ruler's encampment and kill him. Whether every detail is exact or not, the aftermath is clear enough. Rival princes were arrested, tried, and executed. Important women of the defeated lines also perished. Others were exiled to distant fronts. What followed was not just a purge, but a major redistribution of people, power, and property within the imperial family. After 1251, the balance of the dynasty had changed profoundly. This political order rested not only on succession, but on the division of the empire among members of the ruling house. Like earlier steppe polities, the Mongol Empire treated conquered lands as the shared possession of the imperial family. Princes and princesses were given portions of this common patrimony as apanages. In a pastoral world, land meant pasture, movement, and access to people. Each member of the dynasty needed a defined territory for encampment, seasonal migration, and support. Each also received groups of subjects and military units. Such an inheritance was known as an ulus, a political domain made up of land, households, commanders, and rights. Alongside these princely domains stood the central domain directly controlled by the Khagan, which included the imperial guard and the core resources needed to sustain central rule. The largest of these apanages went to the sons of Chingis Khan by his chief wife. Jochi received the far western lands, stretching across the steppe world toward Khwarezm and beyond. Chagadai was assigned a vast region centered on the lands between the Ili Basin and Transoxiana. Ogedei's own territory lay farther east, and after he became Khagan, it passed to his son. Tolui's situation was less clearly described in the sources. Some traditions imply that he remained constantly near his father, and may not have received a fully defined territorial domain during Chingis Khan's lifetime. Others suggest that as youngest son, he was destined to inherit the ancestral homeland. The ambiguity itself is revealing. Later, political struggles encouraged different branches of the family to exaggerate or reduce Tolui's original rights depending on their needs. Within each apanage, the ruling prince was expected to enjoy a degree of autonomy. Succession inside these domains also tended to follow seniority, though here too, rulers sometimes tried to nominate their own heirs. The Khagan, however, could intervene. He might remove a designated successor, replace him with another relative, or appoint a widow or regent to govern in the name of a child. Through such interventions, the imperial centre extended influence into very distant regions. This was especially important because the empire's vast spaces could not be ruled by direct command alone. They had to be managed through a combination of family hierarchy, local delegation, and political bargaining. The idea that the dynasty ruled collectively appeared most clearly in the great assemblies that decided major affairs. These gatherings were called to choose a Khagan, authorize campaigns, settle legal matters, and approve important arrangements. The same principle of shared dynastic participation shaped war itself. Campaign armies were often built by drawing fixed proportions of troops from the forces of multiple princes. Conquest was not merely the work of one branch of the family. It was presented as a joint enterprise of the imperial house. Major expeditions usually included commanders from several branches, so that victory, plunder, and future rights in the conquered lands could be claimed by more than one line of descent. Even the permanent garrisons left behind in newly subdued regions were raised in this collective way, with contributions from different princely forces. As conquest spread into sedentary lands, apanages became more complex. Princes and princesses did not receive only pasture and nomads. They could be granted towns, tax rights, annual revenues, workshops, craftsmen, and entire dependent populations. A prince's share might therefore include both steppe territory and urban income. Some cities were assigned to members of the dynasty even before they had been fully subdued, at least in principle. Other grants reflected who had taken part in a city's capture. In northern China, for example, populations and revenues were divided among Chingisid lines after victory. The same logic operated elsewhere. Conquest produced rights, and rights were converted into claims over wealth, labour, and taxation. The western dominion of Yoshi's descendants offers the clearest example of how such domains could evolve. At first, Joshi's inheritance seems to have been tied more closely to the forest peoples and the lands around the Irtish and Altai. Over time, especially after the Great Western campaigns, the centre of gravity shifted dramatically westward. Under Batu, the power later known as the Golden Horde took shape across the Chipchak steppe, Khwarezm, the Volga basin, and the lands touching the Russian forest zone and the Danube frontier. This was an enormous and open-ended dominion. Its grasslands were rich, its frontier invited further expansion, and its rulers possessed room to grow in ways the other branches did not. Within it, Yoshi's many sons also held their own territories, creating a layered order in which seniority, dignity, and inheritance existed side by side. The coup that placed Monke on the throne brought new redistribution here as elsewhere. Some lands and rights passed to surviving lower-ranking princes from the defeated branches, especially those who had supported the new order or were too young to be implicated in resistance. Other gains strengthened the Toluid house. In places such as Tibet and the regions nearer the Altai, new arrangements carved out fresh domains for Monke's brothers. The old political map of the dynasty did not disappear, but it was redrawn. The empire remained one in theory, yet within it, the balance of internal power was shifting steadily. Women of the ruling house played an important role in this world. Steppe societies had long allowed elite women a degree of public authority that astonished many observers from sedentary civilizations. Earlier, inner Asian states had seen politically active queens and dowagers, and the Mongol world continued this pattern. Widows of Khagans could serve as regents for the empire. In other branches of the dynasty, royal women governed on behalf of sons too young to rule. Princesses attended major assemblies and took part in political decision-making. Some of the most important changes in the empire's history were shaped by women acting behind the scenes, and, at times, openly. Sorkaktani, widow of Tolui and mother of Monke, Kubilai, Hulegu, and Arikboke, became one of the most formidable political figures of the age. Other royal women guided policy, advised rulers, and helped direct strategy across vast distances. This did not mean that the Mongol Empire accepted female sovereignty in a normal sense. Women could influence power, preserve it, administer it, and transmit it, but they were almost never recognized as sovereign rulers in their own right. Even so, the scale of their influence was remarkable. High-ranking women could possess their own encampments, armed followers, and estates. They appeared prominently in public ceremony and were treated with visible respect. Travellers from outside the steppe repeatedly noted their confidence and authority. Compared with the norms of many sedentary societies, especially in the medieval Islamic world, elite Mongol women had far greater political room to act. The machinery through which the Mongols governed conquered territories also grew more sophisticated over time. Two of the most important offices in this system were those commonly described as resident governors or overseers. In some cases, these men supervised client rulers and watched over recently conquered states. In others, they acted more directly as administrators of cities, tax districts, and regions. Their duties overlapped, and the terminology could shift, but the essential principle was clear. The Mongols placed trusted agents into conquered lands to monitor loyalty, organize taxation, supervise local elites, and ensure that orders from the imperial center were carried out. This system appeared early in Central Asia and Iran. After the destruction of the Khwarezmian state, governors were placed in key cities and regions. Some came from Khitan or other non-Mongol backgrounds and had the administrative experience the conquerors needed. Their responsibilities included collecting taxes, organizing local defense, assigning labor obligations, handling supplies, and receiving important visitors. In Khorasan and neighboring regions, such men gradually came to preside over large territorial administrations. Some first arrived as military deputies but evolved into powerful governors whose authority extended over finance, census taking, workshops, and civil order. These developments marked an important step in the transformation of conquest into government. In Iran, one major change came when administrative responsibilities over the lands west of the Oxus were gathered into a larger regional structure rather than left in the hands of purely military commanders. The general in charge of the army retained military duties, but a governor now presided over civilian administration across a huge span of territory. Similar arrangements emerged in northern China and in Central Asia. These were not fully separate civil governments in the modern sense. Military rule still framed everything. Yet the empire was becoming more bureaucratic. The Mongols were learning that conquest on this scale required records, tax registers, scribes, supply systems, and regional offices, not just cavalry and fear. In the early years of Mongol rule, taxation was not yet a stable system, but a tool of conquest. Instead of regular predictable taxes, the first demands placed on settled populations were often sudden and heavy, designed to support armies in the field or prepare for future campaigns. Cities and regions were required to deliver whatever the conquerors needed most at that moment. Sometimes this meant food and supplies for troops passing through. At other times, it meant more specialized goods. Wealthy cities such as Hamadan, Tabriz, and Ganja were ordered to provide horses, fine clothing, and large sums of money. Rare materials were especially valued. Silks, luxury textiles, and metal goods were demanded in large quantities, reflecting the needs of a nomadic power that lacked such resources in its own environment. In some regions, the requirements became even more specific. Entire populations were ordered to provide tools, weapons, or raw materials. In the lands between the Don and the Danube, every adult male was required to hand over items such as axes and iron. These demands reveal a system still shaped by war rather than administration, where taxation was closely tied to immediate military necessity. Over time, however, these irregular exactions began to take on more structured forms. The Mongols adapted and expanded existing systems, while also introducing new ones drawn from their own traditions. Some taxes were inherited from earlier rulers of the conquered lands, while others originated in steppe practices and were now extended to settled populations. Among the most important was the tax on trade, which applied to commercial transactions and became a key source of revenue in regions where long-distance exchange was thriving. Its introduction appears to have come after the initial phase of conquest. Once the Mongols recognized the economic value of controlling trade rather than merely exploiting it through raids or tribute. Another category of taxation was less clearly defined and could include a wide range of obligations. It often referred to the traditional dues that agricultural populations had long paid to their former rulers. In some contexts, it covered labour obligations requiring peasants to perform work for the state. In others, it referred specifically to land taxes based on agricultural production. In Islamic regions, this meant the continuation of existing systems tied to the use of land, including taxes on cultivated fields and irrigation. The Mongols did not abolish these structures. Instead, they incorporated them into their own system, allowing older fiscal practices to coexist with new demands. One of the most distinctive taxes introduced by the Mongols had its origins in the steppe world. It began as a levy on livestock among nomadic populations, where wealth was measured in animals rather than land or coin. Leaders could demand a certain proportion of herds to support their followers or assist allies. Under Ogode, this system was formalized into a regular obligation, with a fixed share of livestock taken for the ruler's household and for charitable purposes. The rate could fluctuate depending on circumstances, but the principle remained the same. It was a tax rooted in mobility and pastoral life, later adapted to suit the needs of a vast empire. As Mongol rule deepened, this levy was transformed into something entirely new when applied to settled populations. It became a form of head tax imposed not on land or production, but on individuals. This marked a significant shift in how taxation was understood. Instead of focusing on fields or harvests, the system now counted people. To make this possible, large-scale censuses were conducted across different regions. These counts served multiple purposes. They allowed the state to assess its resources, organize military recruitment, and establish a basis for taxation. Once the census was completed, each person could be assigned a fixed obligation. Under Monkey, this head tax was regulated more carefully. It was to be collected once a year, and its proceeds were directed towards specific functions of the state. These included maintaining the courier network that connected the empire, supporting official envoys and funding large labour projects. The tax was structured to reflect differences in wealth. rich individuals paid significantly more than the poor, creating a graduated system that recognized economic inequality. In some regions, local administrators adjusted these rates further, increasing the burden on the wealthy while keeping the lowest payments relatively small. This approach allowed the Mongols to extract resources without completely destroying the economic base of the populations they ruled. Despite these innovations, the Mongols did not dismantle the existing fiscal order. Traditional land taxes remained in place alongside the new system. Agricultural producers continued to pay dues based on their harvests, and these could be substantial. In some accounts, they amounted to a large portion of total production. At the same time, certain older practices were abandoned. One notable example was the confiscation of property from individuals who died without heirs. Although this had been common in earlier systems, the Mongols rejected it. The reason appears to have been cultural rather than economic. Among steppe societies, there existed a strong aversion to contact with the possessions of the recently deceased. This belief led the conquerors to give up a potentially valuable source of revenue, illustrating how deeply their traditions influenced policy. Law under the Mongols reflected a similar combination of tradition and adaptation. The rulings associated with Chingis Khan were remembered as a set of authoritative principles governing many aspects of life and governance. These were not a single fixed code in the modern sense, but rather a collection of decisions, customs, and precedents. Over time, they came to represent the moral and political order established by the founder. Later rulers treated them with great respect, preserving and expanding them as new situations arose. Important decisions were sometimes recorded and consulted during major assemblies, reinforcing the idea that the empire was guided by a shared set of principles rooted in its origins. The scope of these rulings has often been debated. Some later traditions imagined a comprehensive legal code issued at a single moment, but the evidence suggests a more gradual development. Individual decisions were made in response to specific needs, and later gathered into a broader body of practice. These rules covered matters of governance, military organization, and administration. They also addressed broader issues of conduct and order. Over time, they were supplemented by additional regulations introduced by successive rulers. What emerged was not a rigid system, but a living framework that could evolve with the empire. Reconstructing this body of law is difficult. Later, writers sometimes projected their own practices back onto the time of Chingis Khan, attributing to him rules that were actually developed generations later. This has made it challenging to distinguish between original principles and later additions. Some supposed regulations appear nowhere in earlier sources and are likely inventions. Others may reflect genuine traditions but were reshaped to suit new political contexts. The result is a complex and sometimes contradictory picture, in which law is as much a reflection of memory and authority as of actual practice. At its core, Mongol law emphasized order, hierarchy, and collective decision-making. Major issues were discussed in assemblies where members of the ruling family gathered to decide on succession, military campaigns, and judicial matters. One principle often highlighted was the requirement that no one should seize power without the agreement of the wider dynasty. Whether this rule was always followed is another matter. In reality, power struggles frequently broke out, and force often determined the outcome. Yet the ideal of collective agreement remained important, shaping how such conflicts were justified and remembered. By the middle of the 13th century, the structure of Mongol rule had become highly complex. In some regions, earlier states had been completely destroyed and replaced by direct Mongol administration. In others, local rulers continued to govern under Mongol supervision, paying tribute and obeying imperial authority. large territories were assigned to members of the ruling family, while other areas remained under the direct control of the central court. Military commanders, regional governors, and local dynasts all played roles within this system, creating a layered and often overlapping pattern of authority. In certain areas, Mongol princes were stationed near subject rulers to ensure their loyalty. In others, governors acted as intermediaries between the central power and local elites. The situation was further complicated by the presence of military units, whose commanders answered not to the central ruler but to individual princes. This meant that authority could be divided and contested even within the same region. Over time, additional layers of administration were introduced to manage these complexities. Regional bureaucracies were established to oversee taxation and coordinate governance across large territories. These institutions were responsible not only for collecting revenue, but also for distributing it among members of the ruling family. Such arrangements often led to tension. Governors sought to assert control over taxation and administration, while local rulers attempted to expand their own authority. Military leaders sometimes acted independently, exploiting their position to extract resources. Princes with overlapping interests could come into conflict, especially when their domains lay close to one another. These tensions were manageable as long as expansion continued and the empire's resources grew. But as time passed and new generations emerged, the sense of shared purpose began to weaken. The bonds that had once united the ruling family became less effective as distance and rivalry increased. Another source of conflict lay in the relationship between the central ruler and the wider dynasty. Members of the ruling family often maintained their own networks of influence within the administration. They could intervene in provincial affairs, issue commands, and compete for resources. Periods of political uncertainty, such as the interregnum, following a ruler's death, provided opportunities for them to expand their power. In such moments, the balance between central authority and dynastic autonomy became particularly fragile. Mongol attempted to address these challenges through a series of reforms aimed at strengthening central control and stabilizing the empire's finances. He sought to regulate the use of official authority, recalling documents that had been issued too freely in earlier years. The imperial courier system was restricted to official business, and merchants were no longer allowed to use it for private gain. Tax exemptions granted to certain groups were removed, and princes were forbidden from interfering in fiscal matters without approval. These measures were designed to increase efficiency, broaden the tax base, and reduce the strain on subject populations. At the same time, Mongol recognized the limits of centralization. The apanage system remained in place, and the collective nature of governance could not be entirely dismantled. His reforms, therefore, represent a balancing act between the need for order and the realities of a system built on shared power. While he aimed to strengthen the central government, he could not eliminate the influence of powerful princes or the traditions that underpinned their authority. The empire's unity depended on several key factors. The ruling dynasty itself provided a sense of shared identity, as its members were linked by blood and by their participation in conquest. A broader aristocratic network, composed of leading families drawn from across the empire, reinforced this unity. These elites were spread across vast distances but remained connected through service, marriage, and shared interests. The communication system also played a crucial role, linking distant regions through a network of relay stations that allowed information and goods to move efficiently. Finally, there was a deep commitment to the legacy of Chingis Khan. His example and his principles were seen as the foundation of the empire's success, and his descendants were expected to uphold them. After the surrender of Arik Burke efforts were made to present a sense of restored unity within the Mongol world. A grand assembly was proposed to confirm Kubilai's authority, and invitations were reportedly extended even to distant and hostile rulers. Yet this gathering never materialized. The appearance of unity proved to be little more than an illusion. Power remained fragmented, and rival centers of authority continued to act independently. In Central Asia, the situation quickly slipped beyond Kubilai's control. Following the death of a local ruler, a new prince was sent to govern the region and represent imperial interests. At first, he shared authority with another claimant, but this arrangement collapsed almost immediately. The stronger figure pushed aside his counterpart and soon turned against Kubilai himself. From that moment onward, the Eastern ruler's influence in Central Asia effectively ended. Meanwhile, the leaders of the Western steppe territories showed no willingness to recognize his authority. Even after changes in leadership, their stance remained unchanged. For years, Kubilai's only reliable allies were found in the western lands ruled by Hulagu and his successors. At the same time, another powerful figure emerged in the heart of Central Asia. A descendant of an earlier ruling line, he began to assemble his own domain, drawing strength from regions that had once belonged to his ancestors. Initially aligned with one side in the struggle for succession, he later rejected all attempts to bring him into the orbit of the Eastern court. His authority grew steadily, not through inheritance alone, but through careful alliances and persistent effort. At first, he clashed with neighbouring rulers, but eventually reached agreements that allowed them to coexist and even cooperate. Together, they divided control over key territories, ensuring that each retained a share of the region's wealth. From his base near the Talas region, this new power centre expanded its influence. Over time, it absorbed neighbouring territories and extended its authority into lands previously governed by other branches of the Mongol family. When a rival ruler died, he moved quickly to assert control and began appointing local leaders himself. These figures governed in his name, and some remained loyal allies for decades. Administrative systems were also brought under his influence, including experienced officials who had once served earlier rulers. Through this combination of military strength and administrative continuity, he created a durable political structure that stood in opposition to the Eastern Empire. This emerging order did not merely reflect internal divisions. It also reshaped relationships beyond the Mongol world. As conflicts intensified, alliances began to cross traditional boundaries. In the West, one Mongol ruler turned toward the Islamic world, emphasizing shared religious ties in an effort to build support against his rivals. At the same time, his opponent sought assistance from Christian powers in Europe. Diplomatic messages were exchanged, proposing coordinated campaigns against common enemies. For the first time, Mongol leaders openly sought external alliances against one another, signaling a profound shift in the nature of their politics. These developments marked a turning point. The Mongol Empire hadn't lost its vast territories, and the ruling family still held power across an enormous geographic range. From China to the steppes of Eastern Europe, authority remained in the hands of Chingis Khan's descendants. Yet the idea of a single, unified empire had faded. Each region now followed its own path, shaped by local priorities and rival ambitions. In the east, Kubilai achieved remarkable success. He completed the conquest of southern China and established a unified government over lands that had long been divided. His influence extended into neighbouring regions, bringing them into a system of tribute and political dependence. These achievements secured his place as one of the most powerful rulers of his time. Yet even at the height of his success, his authority was not universally accepted. Other branches of the Mongol family continued to challenge his position, refusing to acknowledge his supremacy. While political divisions deepened, the legacy of Mongol conquest remained deeply etched across the lands they had overrun. Their campaigns had transformed entire regions, leaving behind both destruction and the foundations for new forms of rule. Earlier invasions by other powers had been severe, but none had matched the scale and intensity of the Mongol advance. Cities were destroyed, populations displaced, and agricultural systems disrupted. The impact was so profound that it reshaped the memory of entire societies. Contemporary observers struggled to comprehend what they had witnessed. Many described the invasions as an unprecedented catastrophe, comparing them to the greatest disasters known from history or legend. Accounts speak of cities emptied of life, of vast regions turned into wasteland, and of violence that seemed to defy explanation. Some writers suggested that the invaders sought not wealth or territory, but destruction itself. Others argued that the brutality served a purpose, instilling fear and preventing resistance. Still others saw it as part of a broader strategy, aimed at eliminating opposition and securing resources for a nomadic way of life. These descriptions, however, were often shaped by emotion and exaggeration. Writers, who lived through the events or recorded them shortly afterward, frequently used dramatic language, emphasizing the scale of the suffering. Stories circulated of extreme cruelty, of entire populations wiped out, and of acts of violence that seemed almost unimaginable. Later accounts repeated and expanded upon these themes, reinforcing the image of the Mongols as agents of total destruction. Yet a closer examination reveals a more complex reality. The treatment of conquered populations varied, depending on circumstances. In open countryside, advancing forces often focused on disruption, rather than systematic destruction, targeting people when possible, but moving quickly through the landscape. In fortified cities, outcomes depended largely on the response of the defenders. Those that resisted fiercely or prolonged a siege often faced severe consequences, including large-scale killing and enslavement. In contrast, cities that surrendered quickly were usually spared the worst forms of violence, though they might still be required to provide labour, supplies, or troops for further campaigns. Patterns begin to emerge when these events are compared. Resistance, rebellion, or the killing of Mongol envoys often triggered harsh reprisals. The death of a Mongol commander during a siege could lead to particularly brutal outcomes, with entire populations targeted in retaliation. On the other hand, pragmatic considerations also influenced decisions. Skilled workers were frequently spared and relocated, while others were incorporated into the expanding Mongol war machine. In some cases, even after initial destruction, cities were later repopulated or rebuilt under new administration. The numbers reported in historical accounts present another challenge. Many sources provide figures that are clearly exaggerated, sometimes reaching into the hundreds of thousands or even millions. These numbers often reflect attempts to convey the scale of the disaster, rather than precise calculations. Some may have been based on rough estimates, or symbolic expressions of loss. Others could have been influenced by the conquerors themselves, who sometimes exaggerated their achievements to intimidate enemies, or enhance their reputation. More modest figures, associated with smaller Elmudan and regions, tend to appear more credible. These suggest that while the destruction was indeed severe, it wasn't always as absolute as some accounts imply. Evidence from travellers and observers indicates that in many places populations survived, even if greatly reduced. In some cities, life continued in diminished form, while others were gradually restored over time. It is also important to recognise that not all devastation can be attributed solely to the Mongols. Prior conflicts, internal struggles, and the actions of local rulers had already weakened many regions before the invasions began. In some cases, cities had been damaged or depopulated by earlier wars. After the Mongol campaigns, further instability continued to cause harm. Competing leaders, bandit groups, and displaced forces contributed to ongoing violence, making recovery even more difficult. The destruction of infrastructure played a critical role in this prolonged decline. The dismantling of city defences left settlements vulnerable to repeated akromamla. Agricultural systems, once disrupted, were difficult to restore, leading to shortages and further population loss. Even when direct violence ceased, the long-term effects of the invasions continued to shape the landscape for generations. Despite this, the Mongol period also introduced new forms of order. In some regions, the establishment of stable shasen brought a degree of emnite that had been lacking in previous decades. Trade routes were reopened, administrative systems reorganized, and economic life gradually resumed. For many, this new stability was preferable to the chaos that had preceded it, even if it came at a high initial cost. The campaigns led by Hulagu illustrate this dual nature clearly. In some Monastic, resistance was met with destruction, following patterns established in earlier conquests. In others, submission allowed for continuity under new rulers. Major cities that defied Mongol authority, such as Baghdad and Halab, experienced severe consequences. Yet elsewhere, towns that chose to surrender were spared and integrated into the new Enadam. Religious communities were also affected in different ways. In certain al-Halat, groups that maintained connections with the conquerors received protection. In others, no distinction was made, and entire populations suffered equally. The outcome often depended on local circumstances and the decisions of individual commanders, rather than a single consistent policy. Overall, the Mongol invasions cannot be reduced to a single narrative of destruction. They were shaped by a combination of strategy, circumstance, and perception. Violence played a central role, but it was neither random nor uniform. It followed patterns that reflected both the priorities of the conquerors and the responses of those they encountered. Beyond the immediate destruction of cities, another, quieter but equally devastating process unfolded in the wake of Mongol conquest. Large numbers of people were forcibly taken from their homes and compelled to serve the invaders. These levies were often driven ahead of Mongol armies during sieges, exposed to enemy fire as expendable shields. If they hesitated or resisted, they risked execution by their new masters. Under such conditions, few could expect to survive long enough to return to their families. At the same time, skilled individuals were deliberately separated from the general population. Artisans, craftsmen, and specialists were spared not out of mercy, but because they were valuable. Entire groups of workers were transported across vast distances, relocated to serve the needs of the expanding empire. From Central Asia to the Mongol heartlands, these displaced communities contributed their knowledge to new centres of production. Metalworkers, weavers, and engineers found themselves building for distant courts, far removed from the cities where they had once lived. This forced movement of people was not limited to craftsmen. Waves of refugees fled regions threatened or devastated by invasion. Many moved east or south at first, seeking temporary safety, only to continue their journeys as danger spread. Others travelled westward toward lands that remained beyond Mongol control. Egypt became a major refuge, attracting scholars, officials, and ordinary people alike. Cities such as Cairo absorbed these migrants, growing rapidly as a result. In some cases, entire communities uprooted themselves, abandoning their homes in search of survival. The scale of this migration is difficult to measure, but its impact was profound. Intellectual life, once concentrated in established urban centres, began to shift. Scholars carried their traditions with them, establishing new circles of learning in distant lands. Cultural exchange intensified, even as the regions they left behind struggled with loss and disruption. At the same time, questions arise about the transformation of the landscape itself. Some observers believe that agricultural land was deliberately converted into pasture for the Mongols' herds. There are indications that entire Manatik were cleared of their Asukan, leaving behind open land suited for nomadic hayat. Yet the evidence remains uncertain. In many cases, the decline of agriculture may have been less the result of deliberate policy and more the consequence of war. Irrigation systems fell into neglect, fields were abandoned, and the skilled labour required to maintain them disappeared. The economic effects were immediate and far-reaching. Attajara suffered as routes became unsafe and markets collapsed. Merchants were killed or displaced, and goods that once moved freely across regions were suddenly interrupted. Some industries vanished entirely for a time. Production of luxury goods declined, only to reappear later under new conditions. Yet the Mongols themselves had a strong interest in commerce, and over time, trade networks were restored, often on an even larger scale than before. Urban life also underwent significant changes. Some cities that had escaped destruction continued to thrive, especially those whose rulers had chosen submission. Others, once major centres of culture and commerce, were reduced to ruins. In certain Manatik, recovery began relatively quickly, while in others it took decades or even generations. The pattern was uneven, shaped by local conditions and the choices made during the conquest. Religious and cultural institutions were not spared from the upheaval. Mosques, shrines, and schools were damaged or destroyed in the course of fighting. Libraries were looted, and in some cases their contents were lost. Yet not all knowledge disappeared. Manuscripts were carried away, preserved, and sometimes incorporated into new collections. Scholars who survived continued their work elsewhere, ensuring that intellectual traditions did not vanish entirely. The loss of life among learned communities was nonetheless significant. Many scholars perished during the invasions, while others were scattered across distant lands. Education was disrupted, not only by violence, but also by the removal of young people who might otherwise have pursued learning. In some places, it seemed as though knowledge itself had been driven underground, surviving only in fragments. Despite this, efforts to rebuild began sooner than might be expected. In some regions, recovery was initiated by local populations who returned to ruined cities and attempted to restore them. In others, the Mongols themselves took active steps to encourage reconstruction. Governors were appointed, infrastructure repaired, and new Sagan brought in to repopulate devastated areas. In Central Asia, signs of recovery appeared relatively early. Certain cities regained their importance, supported by the new Nivam that connected distant regions under a single authority. Agricultural production resumed, sometimes with the help of settlers brought from other Manatik. Trade routes reopened, linking east and west in ways that had not been possible before. Elsewhere, recovery was slower. In regions that had experienced repeated Sangharsh, rebuilding faced greater obstacles. Some cities remained abandoned for years, their ruins standing as reminders of the destruction. Yet even here, gradual restoration took place. New settlements emerged, and older ones were revived under different shrait. In Iraq, the rebuilding process began almost immediately after conquest. Administrative officials were tasked with restoring order, clearing streets, and reopening markets. Religious buildings were repaired, and educational institutions resumed their activities. Within a short time, life began to return to Al-Mudun that had suffered the most dramatic scoot. These efforts were often supported by individuals within the Mongol administration, who recognized the importance of stability and prosperity. Infrastructure projects were undertaken, including the repair of irrigation systems and the construction of canals and bridges. Such ekdamat helped to revive al-iqtisad and support the return of a Sukan. Yet, recovery was never complete. Many regions experienced a lasting decline in revenue and productivity. Agricultural output fell and tax dropped significantly compared to earlier periods. Some of this decline can be attributed to the initial destruction, while other factors include later mismanagement and shifting economic priorities. A tijara, which the Mongols encouraged, sometimes took precedence over traditional agricultural systems. In certain Manatic, the transformation was so profound that former centres of power never regained their Prejni importance. New Al-Mudun rose in their place, reflecting the changed political and economic landscape. The balance between regions shifted, creating new patterns of settlement and influence. When comparing Mongol campaigns to those of earlier armies, a more nuanced picture emerges. Violence and destruction were not unique to the Mongols. Other Ilkhuwa had also carried out massacres and devastated Al-Mudun in earlier centuries. What distinguished the Mongols was the scale and speed of their aspect. They were able to conquer vast territories in a relatively short time, applying consistent methods that combined al-Askariyat al-Quwa with strategic calculation. Their actions were not entirely indiscriminate. Responses varied depending on the behaviour of those they encountered. Submission often brought survival, while resistance could lead to severe consequences. This pattern, while harsh, followed a certain logic that can be observed across multiple campaigns. At the same time, the effectiveness of their nizam allowed them to make use of those they conquered. Skilled Efrad were integrated into their empire, contributing to its development. Survivors were often incorporated into new administrative structures, helping to sustain the system that had overwhelmed them. It is also important to recognize that the devastation of the period cannot be attributed solely to the initial conquests. The decades that followed saw continued conflict between rival Mongol rulers. These internal struggles caused further damage, disrupting Manatic that had begun to recover. Movements of nomadic groups into settled lands added to the Adacht, altering patterns of al-Hayat and production. By the late 13th century, the world shaped by Mongol conquest was one of contrasts. Destruction and renewal existed side by side. Some regions flourished under New the Roof, benefiting from expanded tijara and improved al-amn. Others struggled with the lingering Athar of al-Harb, their recovery incomplete. The early 1260s marked a turning point in the history of the Mongol world. A bitter struggle for supremacy erupted between Kublai Khan and Arik Böke in the east, while at nearly the same time a violent conflict broke out between Hulagu Khan and Berke Khan in the west. These overlapping wars shattered what had once been a unified empire. In their aftermath, the vast dominions created by Genghis Khan were no longer governed as a single political entity. Instead, they evolved into several powerful states, each pursuing its own interests, while still claiming a shared heritage. Out of this transformation emerged four major centres of power. In the east, Kublai established his authority over China and Mongolia, ruling what became known as the Yuan Empire. Across Iran, Iraq, and parts of Anatolia, Hulagu's successors governed the Ilkhanate, a state deeply intertwined with the Islamic world. In Central Asia, the lands associated with Chagatai formed another major realm, while the western steppes fell under the descendants of Yoshi, often referred to as the Golden Horde. These divisions did more than redraw political boundaries. They also split the Muslim populations of the empire, placing them under different rulers and conditions, from minority status in China to dominant communities in Central Asia and Iran. Yet this fourfold division does not fully capture the complexity of the situation. Other political formations existed alongside these major powers. In the western reaches of Siberia, a separate branch of the Rashid lineage ruled independently, despite formally acknowledging the authority of their relatives. In Central Asia, the ambitious prince Kaidu carved out a vast and influential domain that rivaled the established Khanates for decades. Meanwhile, groups of displaced Mongol forces formed their own independent communities, such as the Neguderi Mongols, who dominated frontier regions between Iran, Central Asia, and India, and operated beyond the control of any single ruler. Even within the recognized Khanates, unity was often fragile. In the late 13th century, the western territories of the Jochid realm were effectively split between rival leaders, each controlling different regions and competing for dominance. Central Asia itself later divided into two distinct zones, one centered on cities and trade routes, the other shaped by nomadic traditions. Similar fractures appeared elsewhere, revealing that these states were not fixed or stable, but constantly shifting under pressure from internal rivalries and external threats. The idea that the Mongol world consisted of four great Khanates became more widely accepted in later generations, particularly in the 14th century. Writers of that period described the empire in this simplified form, projecting a sense of order onto what had originally been a far more fluid and uncertain political landscape. Over time, this interpretation took on a life of its own, shaping how later historians understood the legacy of the Mongol conquests. Yet the reality was far less symmetrical, shaped not by careful design, but by the outcomes of conflict, ambition, and circumstance. Despite the fragmentation, the concept of a supreme ruler did not disappear entirely. The title of Great Khan still carried symbolic authority, especially in the UN court. Some rulers, particularly in Iran, continued to acknowledge this higher status, maintaining diplomatic and cultural ties with the Eastern Court. However, this recognition was inconsistent and often purely ceremonial. In practice, the regional Khans governed independently, making their own decisions and pursuing their own strategies, without seeking approval from any central authority. At the same time, earlier forms of imperial unity faded away. In the days of expansion, different branches of the ruling family had shared territories, resources, and even military forces across vast distances. By the later 13th century, this system had largely disappeared. Regional rulers seized control of lands, revenues, and populations within their own domains, eliminating the overlapping rights that had once linked the empire together. Wealth and power became increasingly concentrated in the hands of local rulers, especially those who controlled prosperous urban regions, rather than the open steppe. Relations between the different Mongol states were often tense and unpredictable. Alliances shifted frequently, and conflicts could erupt at any moment. In the West, the rulers of the Golden Horde at times opposed the authority of the Great Khan, aligning themselves instead with rival powers in Central Asia. In other periods, diplomatic efforts led to temporary reconciliation, with envoys exchanged and prisoners released. These moments of cooperation, however, rarely lasted. Suspicion and competition remained constant features of the political landscape. Central Asia occupied a particularly critical position in this fragmented world. Located at the heart of the former empire, it became a zone of intense rivalry and instability. Surrounded by stronger neighbours, its rulers faced constant pressure and often sought expansion as a means of survival. The region became a gathering place for ambitious princes, shifting alliances and military campaigns. making it one of the most volatile areas of the post-imperial Mongol world.